Hello and welcome. My name is Thomas Kevin Dolan. I'm the writer and author of Little Fag, A Journey of Self-Acceptance and Healing. And today I'll begin section 3 of my book. It's entitled Finding Some Depth to My Life. It begins on page 185, and I'll read chapter 1 from section 3. And the title of this chapter is Premonition is Not Coincidence. There have been a number of instances in my life where I knew I would never see someone again. My thought was that they were going to die. It started with my grandfather. I bumped into him and my grandmother as they stepped off a city bus in Calgary. After a quick chat and a warm hug, I said goodbye, only to be possessed by a sudden unease. I turned back and waved, making a mental note of his face and his smile. 2 hours later, he died from a heart attack while watching television. Years later, a dear friend, one of the first I would have known who lived with HIV, invited me out for a drink before he left town to visit his family. On hearing his voice, I sensed it might be my last opportunity to see him. I accepted his offer. The following week, he took his last breath. My eldest brother called one winter day in 1987. He seemed to have a sadness about him. As I hung up the phone, I turned to my wife and said, I need to go see him. That visit would be the last time I would see him alive. Another older brother left an innocuous I love you message on my answering machine one afternoon. Upon hearing his voice, I once again felt that might be the last I'd hear from him. Hours later, his girlfriend would call, sharing that he had died by suicide. My mother turned to me as we left our favorite restaurant in Calgary, saying, This will be my last date with you, dear. I knew what was coming. What I braved. In this lifetime, even during the times I felt I was asleep in my life, I made a commitment to avoid the possibility of regret. Where that wisdom came from, I had no idea. While married and living in Toronto in 1985, I chose to think I could impact some degree of change in my mother's 2 to 3 pack a day smoking habit. My fear was that she'd die of lung cancer. I chose to write a draft of her obituary and send it to her. Although the intention was noble, the impact was disastrous. What did astound me was never hearing about it from her, but instead hearing from a few of my siblings. They were enraged. The idea of my mom dying terrified me. But what angered me more was the horrific addiction she had amassed starting from the age of 16. She'd say, Dear, you may never understand, but smoking gives me joy. It wasn't a joy I could comprehend. As a young Catholic, the notion of judging was always present in my life. But on some level, I was sure that Matthew, from the 7th chapter of the King James Version of the Bible, didn't have a mum who smoked 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Judge not, that ye not be judged, seemed like bullshit. I wondered if this ability to sense others' mortality was related in some way to me knowing my own. As I curiously scratched the surface of what that might mean for me, I uncovered this jewel. As a little boy, in perhaps grade 3 or grade 4, I remember sharing with a friend that I thought I would live to be 93. That thought still seems realistic to me today. I love moving towards my finish line in life. I'm prepared to leave today, but I'm also open to living to 93 and beyond. If there was an advantage of being blessed with this gift of knowing, if in fact it was a gift or even a knowing, I chose to always honor the feeling and commit time and spending time with that person I had the feeling about, whether family or friend, who I felt might be drawing closer to their last breath. While walking on Vancouver's seawall in 2004, Mum called. She spoke quietly and said, Dear, I have some news. Sandy, my doctor, just called to tell me I have lung cancer. My world stopped. Whatever movement swirled around me, it did so in slow motion. I took a breath and said, I'm so sorry to hear that. How can I support you? I told her I was walking on the seawall, and she asked if I was walking by her favorite spot. I asked, You mean the spot where the ferry launches to Granville Island? Her excited response was yes, and that beautiful beach beside it. What's the name of it? She asked. Oh, you mean Sunset Beach. I heard her giggle before she shared. That's the beach I'd love my ashes scattered on. That's one way you can support me. Here it was again, and here I was again, this time with a sense of my mum's mortality. I'd spend the next 2 years flying back and forth between Calgary to Vancouver, spending as much time as I could with my mum. We'd sit and talk. She'd make her famous buns for me to munch on, and I'd bring a Mickey of Canadian rye so Mum could enjoy a rye and Coke. She never stopped smoking, and I became keenly aware of how tired she was becoming. She did not want to be in the hospital and had a pretty solid team of nurses to support her home care. After massive lung surgery to remove the cancer, she also did a number of rounds of radiation to lessen her pain, which took a huge toll on her energy. Her medical support team suggested to me that she might have more rounds of radiation. When I asked Mum how she felt about more radiation, she looked at me and said, "I'm done, dear, no more." We went on what she would call her final date. Mum chose a lovely steak dinner. The restaurant staff treated her like a queen. Her biggest concern was the oxygen bottle running out. That never happened. On October 12th, 2006, again while walking on the seawall, Mum called. She invited me home to see her. As we sat together, for the most part not sharing a word, and her staring out of the window or deep into the flames of a number of candles in her room, she said, "I have one regret." A little stunned, I asked, "What's that?" She quickly replied, "I wish I'd had more kids." With a slight giggle, I said, "You mean being pregnant for 90 or more months in your life wasn't enough?" She smiled and said, 10 kids were the greatest joy of my life." I squeezed her hand. When it was time for me to leave, which she suggested, she thanked me for my love, shared that I was her favorite, and with a grace I didn't recognize from my mum, she told me, "I knew you knew I was going to leave. Thank you for being willing to walk with me on this journey. You've been very generous, and at times I thought how scary this must have been for you. You heard me call, and every time you came. Bless you for that. I love you." I wished her peace and tranquility, and as I left her bedroom, she blew me a kiss. The next morning, she took her last breath. What I braved, despite my mother and most of my family telling me not to be, was being sensitive. I honored the greatest of my superpowers, even though at times I was drenched in loss. That's pretty brave. The unlearning. If anyone had told me I'd be the Dolan that buried Dolans, I would have freaked out and perhaps stepped aside to let others manage the task. Yet this seems to be my lot with my family. The responsibility since the first Dolan took his last breath in 1988 landed on me. As I reflect on why I might have been drawn to this responsibility, this comes up. It was a desire to make sure these Dolans were honored. I realized that most of them had had a hard time honoring themselves in life, so it felt imperative for me to do that for them in death. Of course, there were discomforts associated with taking this on. After some funerals, I'd hear through the dysfunctional triangulated mode of communication that certain siblings felt left out. They wanted some say in how the funeral proceeded. What they never wanted to do was pay the costs. That always landed on me. With a highly tuned sense of wanting the proceedings associated with all the funerals to be meticulous, I always thought there were aspects of my loss and my grieving that would be impacted. Funny enough, it never seemed to be true. After each experience, sitting back and catching my breath, I had this strange replay, almost in slow motion, of parts of the funeral or funerals that I thought I had missed. I was told that one of my nephews draped himself across his father's casket at the cemetery. At the time, I stated that I saw none of that. But days later, in what I think was a dream, not only did that play out as something I did see, but also many other details came to me. My subconscious replayed it for me when I was on my own. My grieving had begun. Of course, there were also typical and perhaps classic antics to anticipate when a divided family of some 25 years gets together at a funeral. Mom and Dad spent most of their 33-year marriage fighting. By the time of the funeral, they had separated. By the time of the first funeral for the Dolans, they'd been separated and had not seen one another for 25 years, until the occasion of their eldest funeral in 1988. Due to a history of violence, I had prepared for all hell to break loose. I'm sure the funeral directors thought I was overreacting when I insisted on doubling the security staff. In the end, no one threw a punch. Most of these family members whom I was burying had lived lives that were not rich in taking personal responsibility for what they had created. The circumstances arranged from abandoning children to leaving huge debt or ignoring attempts by so many to connect with them. In a whimsical moment, I remember thinking, they're dead. I'm sure they don't care. The unlearning for me was making sure that I didn't follow in their footsteps and also shirk responsibilities and recognizing the disturbing impact of these choices. I was, after all, cut from the same cloth. The payment of the funeral costs felt honorable, a dynamic that was non-existent in my experience of being a Dolan. A number of my friends at times would comment that wasn't the responsibility for burying and ultimately shouldering the costs, wasn't that something your parents would actually do? And I giggled like I just giggled then. No, that would never be the case. Financial responsibility was not a forte of either my father or my mom, James or Dorothy. Did I step in because I wanted to be loved? Yeah, that was probably it. Was I breathing life into a shadow mask or a shadow that I can actually be, and that would be people pleaser? Absolutely. And of course at the time, because I desired to be loved so much that it didn't really matter what I did, at the time I never questioned it. Remember, one of the dynamics for adult children of alcoholics is not knowing what normal is. So the abnormal, right, of parents taking care of the costs of bearing their children was something that was not even on my parents' radar. So it was normal for parents to do that, right? I thought it was normal, the abnormalness of my parents not doing it. I thought that was normal. Perhaps that sounds confusing, but that is the dynamics of growing up with an adult as an alcoholic, where the father is an alcoholic and being the child of an adult alcoholic. So it is confounding to me, although I must acknowledge that I think that dynamic is complete, right? As of today, of the 10 children that came through my mom, remember the first survived 5 days, and on some level I'm grateful for that. I'm glad that she didn't have to spend a lifetime of pain like her 4 other older siblings. So of the 9 past her, there's only 3 of us surviving now. And a younger sister will be taken care of by her family. And the youngest we have no connection to, so we're not really sure how that will roll out. But I feel like my responsibility now for bearing Dolans is complete. I'm honored. I'm glad I did that. And as I mentioned to you and wrote in the story, it felt like a way to kind of ease their lives, although they were dead, and to be able to honor them for ways that they weren't honored while they were alive. And it felt important to me, right? They were, most of them, my big brothers and sisters, and one of them, my younger sister of a year and a half. Thankfully, her family took care of all those costs. So I'm done, and it actually feels really terrific. The other thing I wanted to touch on was this kind of knowing that I was going to visit somebody or be with somebody and get a sense that they weren't going to be alive for much longer. Probably the most profound were my grandparents, my grandfather in particular. I can still feel the hug from him as they walked away from the bus stop, and I'd seen them on that day. And then knowing 2 hours later he had taken his last breath, I would be the last of the grandchildren to see our grandfather alive. So I felt honored in some way. And although he didn't impart wisdom that day with me, I can feel his hug. And when I look back, I had this warm smile for him. And I'm great at making up stories, and I usually make up really great stories. It felt like that was a warm and gentle goodbye from my grandfather. And on top of that, this idea of it being another one of my superpowers. It's not haunting for me. It's not scary for me. If anything, for me, it feels like a whisper from the universe for me not to live with regret by actually not going and being with somebody when I felt it and actually honored that. I know that some of my siblings, held regret for not showing up. Even my mom, her oldest son had asked at one point in time, could he drop some things off? And she was pretty patient with him. He was also alcoholic, and for some reason said no. And it would be the last opportunity she would have had to see him. And of course, she would never stop saying to me how horrible she felt, how guilty she felt for not saying yes. And I was gently reminded that each time, whether it was family or friend, each time I listened to that whisper, and I went, and I spent time, and I don't live with any regret at all, which is really amazing. So I have learned to love that whisper. I'm a keen listener for it now, and I always know that it's an opportunity to respond with love.